So today we are talking about systems of articulation, logics of change. This is from Will Straw from the early 90s. So a little bit of difference between how music scenes worked then and how they work today, but hopefully you will notice some patterns. The language of this reading is somewhat more challenging than your textbook readings. There are some large-ish English words that are not in super current use. I believe Will Straw uses the word "inasmuch" at one point in the reading, "inasmuch as" that type of language appears. So try not to be intimidated by that. You don't have to talk like that. That is early 90s academia writing style. Don't worry about it too much. And the purpose of my lecture today is to make sure we understand the most portable parts of the reading that we can later bring to our understanding of video game scenes and other scenes of production. A scene is different from a department or another unit of industrial organization. So the first objective here is to understand what a scene is and what it does, how it leads to the creation of culture, generation of culture, and also how it functions within the monetization of culture. So objective number one is understand scenes of cultural production in relation to industries, venues, and other sites of community. We have some narratives, some anecdotes from this reading about music venues and going to them. The next objective is to understand the logics of distinction and unity and the tension between them. So even though this is a communication studies course, we are engaging a little bit of our sociological brain here, our sociological imagination, but also our knowledge of sociological concepts, especially through this idea of distinction, because scenes are places where distinction and other economic forces meet. Just to check with everybody, who has taken at least one sociology course? At least one sociology course here. Okay, most people have taken a sociology course. If you haven't, hopefully I will still make things clear enough what's going on with respect to these music venues that Will Straw is talking about. But feel free to bring questions after my brief speed run lecture here. And finally, and this is important for the end of the course when we are thinking about video game scenes, you should begin to connect the special dynamics of the music industry with the general dynamics of the other cultural industries. So scenes are especially important for music industries, partially because music is an art form that requires a performance, but that can be done relatively cheaply as compared with other more industrial performance forms like opera or something like that, or large-scale theater. When we're talking about the kind of music that Will Straw is writing about, we're especially thinking about dance music and music played by bands, where the music is the focus and there isn't too much expensive pageantry around the music. There are our three objectives. So first off, Will Straw uses this abbreviation. There are a few industrial abbreviations that appear in the article that are useful to know, but probably the most important and strange one is this term A&R. A&R. This is a crucial term for people who work in the music business. A&R people have special powers. And the reason for that is that A&R stands for artists and repertoire. Artists and repertoire. Repertoire is the collection of music that artists perform. So in olden times, this referred to things like sheet music. Nowadays, it is collections of songs and recorded music that artists can take and reuse. Sometimes an artist has written their own repertoire, sometimes they're getting it from other people. A massively powerful artist such as Taylor Swift will work with other songwriters in addition to herself. So that's why this concept of repertoire can be separated from artists. And of course, the artists are the musicians themselves, who are at the center of the public image of the record company. As a result, A&R departments and A&R workers have special power because musicians are usually not well paid. Sometimes they are impoverished, but generally they're not well compensated for making music until they get support. They are lucky and they get support from the right organizations and people. And up until recently, it was major record labels and their artists and repertoire departments who were the suppliers of money to musicians. So if you worked for this department as an A&R, you had this power. You could dangle the hope of future success over struggling musicians who are trying to find money for rent and groceries and things like that. You could make this kind of promise to people where I will connect you with someone else who will make you a star or something like that. There are all sorts of legends in the music industry of this type of interaction with the artists and repertoire departments. So when you're thinking about how a small group of people making music together links up with the massive world of record companies and the mass culture, mass media production of music, the A&R department is at that vector where those things meet. That's why it has so much power. All right. So we delve into, as ChatGPT used to say a couple of years ago, we will delve into the text of the article, and here Will Straw gives us an idea of what a scene is. He borrows this concept from another academic named Barry Shanks, and Barry Shanks took this idea from a term that was circulating among music scenes already. So there's a production process for academic terms here, where things start in the community, empirical categories, academics borrow these terms in the community and they develop them and give them more specific definitions, and then academics further borrow these terms from each other. Then later there's sometimes a feedback process where art communities borrow the terms again from academics, and we will look at that a little bit later. So Will Straw says, as a point of departure, one may posit a musical scene as, so a definition is coming. When you see language like this, you can highlight this in the reading. This helps understand everything else. One may posit a musical scene as distinct in significant ways from older notions of a musical community. Okay, so we're developing this concept to make a historical difference. There used to be one practice of music, and presumably a scene is something different. The latter, so the older notions, presumes a population group whose composition is relatively stable, according to a wide range of sociological variables, and whose involvement in music takes the form of an ongoing exploration of one or more musical idioms said to be rooted within a geographically specific historical heritage. Lengthy terms, but what we can think about here, for example, if you are thinking about the Beatles, hugely popular Beatles, but they came from a folk-like music scene that was called skiffle. They were originally a skiffle band. So in Liverpool, they were making this skiffle style of music, and skiffle is a relative of a practice that you will find in Newfoundland and that also exists in many other cultures. You might be familiar with this sort of thing happening depending where you grew up or what your family liked to do. But in Newfoundland, there's a practice called a kitchen party. So a skiffle band had this romanticized notion that in the olden times, people used to just get together and make music together in their kitchens, have these informal parties at home. And the Beatles developed a little bit of that fantasy within their musical style. So we had a geographic region, and we had a focus on a particular style of music, and then the Beatles kind of emerged from that. Then they went international, and they made lots of money and lots of songs and so on. But that is this older sense of musical style that Will Straw is thinking about. We have a geographically contained region, and from that region. You have a sustained focus on a particular musical style. A musical scene, in contrast, is that cultural space. So space is a super complex term. Perhaps we'll come back to that in discussion later, but is a cultural space in which a range of musical practices coexist, interacting with each other within a variety of processes of differentiation and according to widely varying trajectories of change and cross-fertilization. So the special thing about a scene is that it is not as focused or centralized as these earlier notions of musical community that Straw references. A scene is decentralized. And you can think of the development of music scenes as related to the development of the internet and other communication technologies that allow people to communicate beyond mass media, but also to form informal groups quite quickly and disband those groups equally quickly. So a scene is decentralized. And this becomes quite interesting for people when they are doing things later. Straw doesn't talk about this, but later we'll consider how this works with regard to things like software companies and video game companies, where keeping the energy and the flexibility of a scene eventually became important in the corporate world. All right. So what is a logic? We have this term logic that comes up often. In the social sciences, logic has a meaning that is different from computer science's meaning for logic and different from philosophy's meaning for logic. So in philosophy, logic might be a system for making good or accurate decisions, and in computer science, it might be a system for directing the flow of information, something like that. But in the social sciences, and especially in the qualitative, theoretical parts of the social sciences, we speak of logic as a way in which people understand what they're doing. So we can think about a logic of practice or a practical logic. So this means that logic is everywhere. Even if somebody is doing something that seems foolish, they still have their own logic for how they're doing it. When we use this term logic, we are thinking of a way that people conceptualize and respond to the world around them. And as a result, we can speak of things like the logic of punk music. Even though punk music is filled with contradictions, we can still speak of the logic of a punk music scene. The word logic comes from logos, which relates to speech. So originally, we would be thinking about how people speak about what they are doing. But in the social sciences and the theoretical parts of the social sciences, we are now thinking sometimes of things that people only say to themselves in their inner monologues, how people justify and rationalize their practices to themselves. And sometimes we might even speak of logics that people don't make explicit even to themselves, just habits that fit together in a way that is like a logic and like a language. So when we see this term logic used in these flexible ways, mark that difference from what logic means here from what it might mean in other disciplines. Unity and difference are some of the most basic concepts that exist. If you took Communications 130, you are familiar with a certain idea from Ferdinand de Saussure, which is this idea that meaning consists in difference, and that language is a system of differences. So difference, we all know what difference is. This part of the board is lit up, this part of the board is not lit up. And this type of binary opposition is one of the most basic things that can exist, just a difference. We notice differences, we develop meaning out of differences. And in music scenes and in cultural industries, we develop not only meaning from difference, but also money from difference, capital from difference. So when you see the term distinction that will come up again and again, the term distinction refers to developing forms of exchange from difference, things that can be monetized and gained from. This concept was especially developed by a sociologist named Pierre Bourdieu, who you can find referenced in Will Straw's article. But we can think of difference as sort of the root of meaning, and then distinction being to develop a special, exchangeable, powerful thing from the difference between what one is doing and what someone else is doing. Artists generate difference, and they generate distinction. Artists need to generate distinction for themselves in order to make money. That is why artists do so many quote-unquote illogical things or strange or surprising things, because they need to differentiate themselves from other artists and other people in order to function as artists. They need that distinction because that is the root of how their art world works, how they get paid, how they eat, pay rent, and so on. At the same time, a scene needs to fit together well enough to maintain lines of communication. So if you have too much difference, sometimes you don't have distinction anymore because people can't even recognize what you're doing. So you need to have the scene have lines of communication. Within music scenes, like Will Straw is talking about, much of that unifying function is done by the venue, the place where the music is made. You can relate this also to this classroom here. So one of the reasons why instructors are always emphasizing attendance is that when you have people in a room, they communicate with each other. They just start communicating. They always start communicating. So when you compel people, you draw them into the same room, they will find ways to exchange useful information, and that is important for people's learning here. But within a music scene, it is important for the development of the various types of music that happen there. So for example, if you're going downtown, say you want to go to an inexpensive show downtown, you can go to a music venue called Redgate. If you look up Redgate music, you don't have to pay much money. Their concerts are often like $20. You bring like a $20 bill, you go in there, and everything is quite disorienting and strange if you're just there for the first time. There are different groups within that space, and it is very difficult to start a conversation with a different group in that space. You'll look around, you'll see some people who are pretending to be bored with everything. They'll be doing this kind of gesture, they don't want to talk to anyone. And you'll see other people wearing really strange stuff, and you will find that there are many groups that have distinctions between them. But in certain situations, they start talking to each other. I mean, perhaps if it's your first time there, you might benefit from a little bit of luck if you're trying to socialize there. Sometimes people will recognize somebody new in a space like that, and they might just come and start talking with you out of curiosity. But generally what you'll see there is a gradual negotiation process as these separate groups figure out how to communicate with each other. Can we dance with this other group? Can we speak with this other group, or will they become annoyed with us? Is the music too loud for us to speak with this other group? And then there are distinctions between the bands who play at a place like that, and then even the whole concerts that happen. So oftentimes you'll have a rock music concert earlier in the evening, and then a DJ concert later in the evening. And a different group of people will come and see the DJ concert. They'll be dancing differently and so on. But there's a little bit of interaction between those two groups, as the people who came for the rock music concert sometimes want to stay out and party more. And so sometimes they'll start socializing with the dance music people, and then sometimes people will make friends that way, and so on. You will also find, and I don't recommend this for your health, but you will also find the smoking area outside of a venue serving this social purpose. A certain number of people end up actually taking up smoking for this reason, even though, please don't do this, it's not good for your health, but many people find smoking areas to be this place where people talk with each other and so on. So artists often develop smoking habits as a result for socialization purposes. Again though, please don't do that. There are many ways to talk with people. You can still talk with people around the smoking area without actually smoking, and so on. I am obligated to encourage you to look after your long-term health. In any case, so we have disruptions within the musical venue, and we have differences and sometimes even conflicts between groups, but they share that space of the venue, which allows the scene to remain intact and allows people to share audiences with each other. So here is the funniest part of Will Straw's article. And here is where he describes going to a nightclub in Hull. So I grew up in Ottawa, which is where Will Straw was going to a conference when he uses this anecdote. And Ottawa is separated from a town in Quebec called Hull by a few bridges. And famously, Quebec has a different drinking age than Ontario does. So Ontario, legal drinking age is 19. Quebec, legal drinking age is 18. And for a long time in Hull, drinking-related laws, alcohol consumption-related laws were not enforced very intensely. So I had stories when I was in high school, once I was in about grade 10, especially the summer after grade 10, I came back to high school and many people in the high school had stories about going drinking in Hull, going drinking alcohol in Hull at age 16 and 17 and all these wild things that happened in the nightclubs in Hull. So it's a little bit of a tradition in the Ottawa area that people cross over this bridge and then they go to Hull and there's partying there and there are super scary bouncers who have reputations for being able to lift up a drunk person with one hand and lift up a drunk person with the other hand and then throw them both out of the club at the same time and things like that. Hull has this reputation. So Will Straw and his academic friends, who are probably dressed kind of like this, they go to a nightclub in Hull being academics. So as academics, they're kind of old. They're definitely older than people who usually go into the nightclub. And they're definitely not dressed in the most party-ish way when they go to this nightclub. And they start dancing. And Will Straw observes that his academic colleagues misinterpret the nightclub. They romanticize the nightclub. So he says, as members of our group began to dance, with in some cases unexpected abandon, it was clear that the space of this club, like the act of dancing itself, evoked within many of them a sense of the eternal. So they go into this club and they feel like it's this magical space where youth culture is forever and cultures blend together and the space is timeless and so on. So he observes his academic friends have this experience of the space. And they have that experience because they don't notice all the ways in which the young people are not talking to each other, strategically not talking to each other, or pretending to be difficult to talk to and all of those things. Because as you know, a nightclub can be a frightening and sometimes hostile space, right? For a while, there was a nightclub on Granville Street that was called Venue Nightclub that had a star-shaped seating area in the middle of the nightclub. So there was the dance floor, but within the dance floor, there were spiny, star-shaped protrusions from the seating area. So you couldn't even really dance freely. You had to navigate around these partitions of the room, these extremely aggressive partitions of the room. And that's what being in a nightclub is really like, if you understand what's happening there. It's a very aggressive space. It can be fun, but it is not an eternally welcoming space where all cultures meld together. It's a complex, negotiated social space that can be quite tense at the same time as it can be fun. It has these two sides to it, the distinction side and the unity, bringing people together side. So the academics just don't notice the other side of this when they go to the nightclub. They say, everybody is together, everybody melds together in the nightclub, which is kind of funny. It's kind of sweet that the academics think of the nightclub this way. They don't understand nightclubs, so they interpret the nightclub as more welcoming than it actually is. But Will Straw also positions himself as more smart in the ways of nightclubs than his academic buddies in this case, because studying these things, he notices that the nightclub is actually filled with these distinctions. Okay. So, have a couple more slides. This is one of Will Straw's points here for why he is talking about scenes. He's here emphasizing the importance of his scene-based research. He says, basing a politics of local or Canadian music on the search for musical forms whose relationship to musical communities is that of a long-term and evolving expressivity, will lead us to overlook ways in which the making and remaking of alliances between communities are the crucial political processes within popular music. So long-winded way of saying this, but he says basically if we don't understand scenes, then we will neglect what actually makes popular music exciting to people. If we think that musical communities develop lengthy, geographically based or aesthetically based obsessions, that they kind of specialize and remain apart from each other, then we will neglect this way in which popular music is always mixing forms that have somewhat arbitrary relationships with each other and producing these strange results, and making and remaking alliances. So there are dramas within popular music scenes, there are types of music that do go together and then suddenly they don't go together again. These things change fast, usually much faster than arts councils and universities track them. And they're based on the logic of scenes rather than persistent industries. Okay, actually that is my last slide. So for a quick review, a scene is decentralized. Things to remember about a scene. A scene is decentralized relative to a persistent art form. So a scene involves many different types of art forms that come together and depart and that change quickly. A scene is productive because of the competitions and differences that happen within it. You can think of a scene as like an engine of distinction, but a scene needs some things to keep it together. It needs a little bit of centralization so that the members of it remain in contact with each other. And sometimes that is a venue, and then nowadays, oftentimes it is an online space. Sometimes it's even something like a hashtag or something like that. And as scenes have become more and more the ways in which music making is organized, they've also become influential in other industries, such as the production of video games, such as the production of software, tech startups, and so on.